Now, with regards to the burial, then it's the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that human beings are supposed to be buried. From the beginning, ever since the sons of Adam alayhi salam passed away, they would be buried, and this is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is also the case with us as well, especially us being Muslim. Muslims should be buried. It's not permissible for a Muslim to be cremated. A Muslim is supposed to be buried, and preferably a Muslim must be buried separately. So a hadith mentions that once the Messenger of Allah ﷺ passed by the graves of pagans, and he said, these people have they preceded a time of good. They came before Islam. And then he passed by graves of Muslims, and he said, these people have received abundant good. Meaning there was different locations, different sections for Muslims and for non-Muslims. So whatever a person is able to do, I know there's some areas, there's a place in London called Gardens of Peace, I think, where it's basically just a Muslim graveyard, and I'm not sure if there's any places here, but sometimes you go to some locations where they have Muslim only graveyards, and that's something which is good. It's encouraged to have that. So it's best, if that's the case, to have dedicated areas for Muslims, or what they might have is basically in the graveyard itself they'll have separate sections. So that's the next best thing. So you do whatever you can in the circumstances, in the situation. And burials should be in the graveyard. It's not permissible for a person to be buried anywhere else. Every person should be buried specifically in the graveyard. And the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he encouraged the Muslims to make the graves deep. He said, make the graves deep, make it spacious, and prepare it well. Make sure it's done properly. And there's different types of graves which are done. One is called a shaq, which is straight down. And one is called a lahad, which goes down and then goes inwards. So it's like an L shape. And of course, in Muslim countries, this is the preferable method of performing the burial, with the lahad grave, because then the body can be lowered and then turned on its side and put in, so the body isn't basically harmed by bricks or dirt or anything like this. But of course, nowadays, especially in these types of countries, there are certain requirements and conditions and regulations that cemeteries have and the government has. So a person, as I said, a person does whatever he can. And with regards to coffins, I heard that there are certain types of coffins which are made out of a very strong type of cardboard. And so Islamically, these are actually probably the closest thing we have in terms of something which doesn't last. Because Islamically, when a body is buried, a body is just shrouded. In a Muslim country, there are no coffins that are used for the deceased, because the idea is that the body is supposed to go back to the earth. مِنْهَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ وَفِيهَا نُعِيدُكُمْ. From it we created you, and to it you go back. So this type of very strong cardboard, it's very durable, but of course paper, card, after a time it basically erodes. So this is something which I've heard about, and if that's the case, then it's something which should be advisable and should be preferable, should be good for Muslims to use. So the body should be prepared, and the body should be shrouded, and there are more shrouds used for the female as opposed to the male, obviously, because the aura of the female is larger. The aura of the female is bigger than the aura of the male. So there's more shrouds applied to the female as opposed to the males, and the blood relatives have more right with regards to placing the body. So generally speaking, men should be responsible for placing the body, and family members have more right. Family members have more right when it comes to placing the body. And when the body is placed, the body should be placed feet first. As is mentioned in certain narrations, that it should be placed feet first. Of course, if it's not able to, because of the coffin and things like this, then of course that's something which we don't have any control over. And as I mentioned before, generally speaking, in Muslim countries, the body is placed on its right, and preferably facing towards the Qibla if that's possible. but is facing towards its right. Because of regulations, here we're not able to do that. But in certain cases, if we are, then that's something which we should try to do. Also, making dua while lowering the body. The Messenger of Allah in the narration mentioned in Ibn Majah, he was placing one of the deceased in the grave and he said, Bismillah wa ala sunnati Rasulillah. He would say, in the name of Allah and according to the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah. So he would say this while he was doing this to show the importance of making adhkar while doing this act. And also interestingly, he's mentioning the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah at a time when people forget the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah and do other types of things at that moment in time when they're burying the deceased. Also, throwing dirt on the grave is something which is recommended for a person to do, before the body is basically going to be covered with dirt, for people to throw handfuls of dirt, and that's something which is also mentioned in the sunnah. Also, once the dirt is being piled on, it should be higher than the ground itself. And those of you who've buried bodies, then you'll know if you've experienced it, because obviously what happens over time is, the dirt settles, soil settles, and so it'll lower. So usually you, put more soil on it, so it looks like it's higher up. But over time, it basically settles and it levels out over a period of time. Also, with regards to marking the grave, then it's not permissible to have tombstones. And what should be done is to have something no higher than a handspan, and just mentioning the basic details. Even if it's something, just a plaque on the ground itself, that's something which is even better, meaning nothing which is propped up. So sometimes you do get certain markings which are basically on the ground itself, and it's not raised up, and just to have the bare minimum information on them, whatever's needed, whatever's necessary, the name, the date when he was born, and the date when he passed away. I think that's basically the bare minimum. That's basically what's required from the bare minimum when somebody passes away. No structures should be placed over the grave itself. No tombstones, no huge monuments or shrines are permissible, because he has his own trial in the akhirah, and you have your life to basically continue to do good deeds. And so when a person does these types of things, you're not benefiting the deceased, and you're not benefiting yourself either. So it's just a matter of wasting one's time when building shrines. And of course, this can lead to even more serious acts like committing shirk, asking loved ones for things when they can't even do anything for themselves. Lastly, inshallah, we'll talk about benefiting the dead and visiting the graveyard. First of all, every single individual is responsible for his or her own actions, and nobody is going to be responsible for carrying the sins of another. That's something which is important for us to remember. We're responsible for our own actions. Now, what can we do to benefit the deceased? The first thing we do, number one, is dua. Making dua for the deceased, supplicating for the deceased. And dua is the weapon of the believer, and it's the essence of worship, as the Messenger of Allah said. And many of us, we neglect supplicating and making dua for our loved ones. We may make dua for a period of time, for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, but then we forget. And this is the nature of a human being, subhanAllah. But my point is that dua is something which we neglect. Sometimes we want to do other things which aren't permissible, yet the things which are permissible for us to do, the things which have the most effect, the most impact, we don't actually do. We're not serious about those things. We don't do as much as we can when it comes to these types of things which are permissible and we're able to do, and we don't do them, like dua, for example. Number two, the Messenger of Allah, he said, outstanding fasts. So he said, whoever died owing fasts, his guardian should fast on his behalf. Obviously, if a person doesn't know, then he doesn't know. But if he knows of any outstanding fasts from Ramadan or from things that he promised he would make fasts for, then you make up for them. If you don't know, then of course you don't know. Number three, from benefiting the deceased, is paying off any debts. As I mentioned before, making sure you pay off debts as soon as possible. The famous hadith of a companion who passed away, and he had 2 dinar that he hadn't paid off, small amount of money. And the Messenger of Allah ﷺ refused to pray over him, to make a point. Not because he didn't want to pray over him because he wasn't a Muslim, but to make a point of the importance of paying off debts. So the companions' narrations mention that other people prayed over him, but the Messenger of Allah ﷺ never prayed over him to make a point about the importance of paying off debts. So when eventually they paid off his debts, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he said, now his skin has become cool. Now he started to cool down, meaning the torment of that money which he hadn't paid off yet was bothering him, was afflicting him until it had been paid off. Also from the things which benefit the deceased is the charity of their children. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he said, amongst the most pleasant a man consumes is what comes from his own earnings, and his child is from his own earnings. Meaning, if a child gives charity for his father, then the father will be, inshallah, rewarded for that charity, because the intention of the child was for it to be given on behalf of the parent himself. Also performing Hajj on their behalf, performing Hajj on behalf of a deceased, and also the Janazah prayer itself. The Janazah prayer is something which obviously is going to benefit the person who has passed away. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he said, whenever a Muslim man dies and 40 men stand for his Janazah prayer, all of them not joining anything with Allah in worship, Allah grants them intercession for him. So this shows us the importance of attending people's Janazah prayers, because if 40 people or more attend, then there's a big reward attached specifically to this.